Eino Juhani Rautavaara was a notable Finnish composer of the 20th and early 21st centuries. He was an eclectic composer of many styles that have been broadly oversimplified into four chronological periods of his life, being a neoclassical period in the 50s, his first serial phase in the 60s, his neo-romantic phase in the 70s, and then his final postmodern era, which included a return to serialism. While these categories are of use to the historian, they should not be taken too seriously, as careful study of his music will show that music from each era contains aspects from all of his periods as he developed as a composer. While the work we will be looking at today, his Third Symphony, is from his first serial phase, there are easily identifiable traits of his postmodern era that are present in this much earlier work, which Rautavaara will even return to in his much later piece, Angels and Visitations. Part 1. Synthesizing Romanticism into a Modern Vocabulary. With his Third Symphony, Rautavaara sought to combine the tonal harmony of Romanticism with the serialism of Modernism. Speaking on his development as a composer at the time, Rautavaara said, quote, "What I wanted was to try to find a synthesis. I think that the 12 tempered tones are the music vocabulary of this century, but the question is the organization of that vocabulary. That is the great question, and my solution was to seek a synthesis of this modernism and tonal harmony, and to use personal variations of the 12-tone technique. That kind of organization did not have anything to do with that of Schoenberg or Webern, but was my way of organizing those 12 tones in a way which led me to use the harmony in the way I wanted." While he distances himself from Schoenberg and Webern, it is worth noting that he does not exclude himself from Berg's lineage, thereby establishing an ideological similarity to Berg in his attempt to use all 12 tones without sacrificing melodic intuition or diatonic reference. To find the influence of Romanticism on Rautavaara's Third Symphony, one need not look any further than the opening horn line. Opening a piece with this nebulous open fifth tonality over a pedal point holds an association with the elemental, the primordial, and the profound. This association was popularized by the operas of Wagner, most notably in the prelude to Das Rheingold. It was then drawn upon by many other fin de siècle Romantic works, with a few notable examples being Bruckner's Fourth Symphony. Strauss's tone poem, Also sprach Zarathustra. And the prelude to Debussy's opera, Pelléas et Mélisande. Rautavaara's use of D minor harmonies to open the work, especially in the low registers, continues the cultural associations of darkness with this key the Romantic composers drew upon. It is no surprise that both Debussy's Pelléas and Rautavaara's Third both state perfect fifths in D minor before quickly veering off into chromaticism. Talking about his creative process, Rautavaara said, quote, "My Third Symphony came into being from an overwhelming desire to write music that would breathe in long, broad, sweeping paragraphs, in the rhythm of the land and the sea," end quote. Clearly, using this romantic association with the elemental helped him achieve music that sounded in the rhythm of the land and the sea. Of those romantic examples, it is Bruckner's Fourth and the style of Bruckner as a whole that Rautavaara most clearly draws upon, if not explicitly references, in his Third Symphony. In many ways, with his Third, Rautavaara sought to renew the spirit of Bruckner's music by using a modern vocabulary. While the opening of Rautavaara's Third bears the most obvious comparison to Bruckner, with it being similar enough to Bruckner's Fourth to almost veer into quotation, Brucknerisms can be found in the overall structure of the work. There's an elemental sense of large-scale motion in the symphony, both reflecting Rautavaara's fascination with symmetry and his channeling of Brucknerian symphonism. The symphony ends as it opened, and each movement is structured as a sweeping wave, something we will examine more closely when we look at the second movement. In the first movement, overt reference to Bruckner's sound world can be found in the brass-centric melodic climaxes and the use of teleological genesis to structure the opening. It can be heard here in Bruckner's fourth. And here in Rautavaara's third. The climax in the Rautavaara has an especially striking quality because of its use of a tritone progression, going from A-flat minor to D major, thereby also making the climax the parallel key of the opening. Now, with the Romanticism of the symphony established, let us dive into the weeds of the latent serialism in the work. While the entirety of the symphony is based off of a 12-tone row, the amazement of Rautavaara's artistry is that to a listener this is essentially unnoticeable. The 12-tone row is as follows. This row is used in a tonal way, and emphasis on fourths and fifths allows Rautavaara to still make ear-catching romantic melodies. This original row is used most apparently for Rautavaara's melodic content, and can be first heard in the opening horn line of the piece. Notably, however, the tone row's identity is obscured as the initial statement is transposed up a major sixth, making it therefore P9 on the 12-tone matrix. When we remove rhythm, the tone row can be easily observed. Listen for the row in the opening horn line. Another example of the complete tone row being stated, this time inverted and transposed up a major second, can be heard in the trombones at the teleological genesis. This is I2 on the 12-tone matrix. Here is the trombone line pictured both with and without rhythm. Listen for the distinct 12 tones in the trombone line as I play the next example. Rautavaara does not only use tone rows to constitute his melodic material, but the seemingly unassuming chromatic woodwind lines littered throughout the first movement are also exact statements of a tone row. The original row, with its emphasis on fourths and fifths, however, is not chromatic enough, and as such, Rautavaara derives a second row from the original tone row that he uses for his accompaniment figures. This derived row, which he called the fifth series from the original, came from a technique taught to him by Vogel that combined the circle of fifths and chromatic scale in an, quote, auxiliary series. The auxiliary series is pictured and is created by first writing out the chromatic scale and then adding a second note that continues the circle of fifths to each note in the chromatic scale that does not follow the circle of fifths. So, G is added on top of C sharp because G follows C in the circle of fifths, but no note is added to D on the chromatic scale because D already follows G on the circle of fifths. Then, the fifth series is derived by taking the original tone row and changing the note anytime an additional note is added on the auxiliary series. So, for example, C stays C, but then the next note, F, becomes B because on the auxiliary series there is a B added above the F. Then E flat becomes A for the same reason, but A flat stays the same because on the auxiliary series there is no second note above A flat. This derived tone row, or the fifth series, can be heard everywhere in the chromatic woodwind lines and is the first bit of musical material heard in the entire piece. This initial statement is the first half of the derived tone row transposed up a minor seventh, being B flat, A, G, F sharp, F, and D. This is the first 6 notes of P10 on the 12-tone matrix of the fifth series. Every woodwind ornamental figure comes from this tone row, with figures that go down being prime statements of the row, and figures that go up being retrograde statements of the row. At the same brass climax where the original series is being articulated by the trombones, the fifth series is simultaneously being stated by the woodwinds. At the climax, the flutes and clarinets play this. The clarinet line is the first half of P10 of the fifth series, just like the flute line that opened the whole symphony. And the flute line is now the second half of R10 of the fifth series, meaning it is the fifth series transposed up a minor seventh and played backwards. This time, when I play the brass climax, ignore the original series being played by the trombones and listen for the fifth series in the woodwinds, which appears rapidly in many different transpositions. The use of the fifth series as an ornamental figure can be heard throughout the entire piece, appearing, for example, in the slow section of the first movement following the climax in the cello line. This line is the first half of P8 of the fifth series. Listen for the fifth series here, where it is more easily audible than the previous examples. Tone rows form the entire basis of this symphony, with almost every musical material relating back to either the original series or the fifth series. When looking at the full matrices of the two series, the many musical options of this otherwise seemingly restrictive technique become quite apparent. Since pointing out each row would require going note by note through the whole symphony, we will move on, but I encourage the listener to search for tone rows on their own time. One last interesting note should be made about Rautavaara's tone rows. Rautavaara had a fascination with symmetry in music, and the construction of both his tone rows reflect this fascination. For the original series, we can break down the prime row and the retrograde row into intervals which look like this. The intervals of the fifth series for the prime row and retrograde row look like this. As you can see, both series are perfectly symmetrical around the tritone, which is placed exactly in the middle. Similar to Bruckner's obsessions, Rautavaara clearly had a personal obsession around symmetry. Part 2. Form and Structure. Rautavaara does not organize his movements in traditional sonata form. For him, quote, "The journey that does not lead into the great unknown is not worth making, at least in art." End quote. And as such, he believed that the recapitulation was, quote, too predictable to be anything but disappointing, and that the development, quote, merely seemed a variation mechanism, end quote. To get around this, but still ensure structural cohesion in his composition, Rautavaara uses Schoenberg's concept of developing variation for the second movement of his third symphony. What results is that the movement is structured as an arch or a wave. This is applicable to the entire movement, but can also be observed on the smaller local level, where each thematic statement takes the shape of an arch or a wave as well. As such, in this movement, repeated ideas are always in transformation, a process that does not recapitulate, but instead presses on through time. Everything in this movement is an organic growth from material presented in the first 3 bars, which is made of a motif first introduced in the horns and an oscillating figure in the violins and violas based on a minor third. Let's hear this important opening material. Interestingly, while the rest of the movement will grow out of this material, these three opening bars are themselves a growth out of the opening of the symphony, due to its suggestion of the P1 transposition of the original tone row, and, more obviously, the characteristic open fifths played by French horn over a pedal point. The bassoons then have the second statement of this motif, with violins and violas still holding the oscillating minor thirds, but this time on A rather than on C sharp. This time, the motif will go in a different direction, growing into a new melody that smoothly leads into the first fortissimo culmination of the movement. Listen to how the second statement of the motif departs from how the original statement unfolds, thereby showing an example of developing variation and suggesting a form of organic waves. The brass culmination uses fourths, fifths, and seconds, thereby simultaneously recalling the culmination of the first movement and evoking Bruckner, while also being a natural outgrowth of the original motif of the second movement, which itself is melodically based entirely on fourths, fifths, and seconds. We then move to a second section, a section B, perhaps, where there are oscillating quavers similar to the first section, but this time now oscillating by the interval of a second rather than a third. A sweeping cello line then adds a new motif. The third and final section of the movement then attempts to transform the material of section B back into the original material, thereby fitting the arch or wave shape of the movement. This section begins with a motif that has the same rhythm as the opening of section B, but now on different pitches, altered into a lower neighbor note idea. It sounds like this. Now, I'm going to play the opening of section B, followed by the opening to this third section, and listen for the similarity in rhythm between the bassoon line in section B and the horn line in this third section. Departing from the melodic contour of a given melody or motif while continuing its rhythmic properties is a trait of Rautavaara's thematic development. Using rhythm in general as a unifying trait to allow for melodic and tonal freedom is a characteristic of this entire symphony, further seen in this movement through the oscillating string quavers. This rhythmic approach to composition is actually a more nuanced similarity to Bruckner. About Bruckner's style, musicologist Karl Dahlhaus wrote, quote, "Musical logic rested on a premise considered so self-evident as to be beneath mention, that the central parameter of art music is its diastematic, or pitch structure." Bruckner's symphonic style, however, unlike that of Brahms's chamber music or Wagner's music dramas, is primarily rhythmic rather than diastematic, and thus seems to stand the usual hierarchy of tonal properties on its head. Rautavaara's use of rhythm for structural cohesion, then, strengthens his comparison to specifically Bruckner rather than Romanticism as a whole. Following the second and final fortissimo culmination of the movement, the opening material then fully returns. The original motif organically grew into new material as heard in section B, and then this material organically grew back into the original motif. While this is a return to the beginning, or the, quote, exposition, it did not come about systematically as prompted by sonata form, but rather was a gradual organic process, thereby giving the large-scale impression of a wave or arch. Listen to the return of the opening statement that closes the movement, only now a perfect fifth up from its original form. The transposition of the opening statement up a perfect fifth is doubtless informed by harmonic symmetry, with the whole movement being framed by a perfect fifth, but also now holding the idea of returning to the starting point while the environment has changed, thereby continuing the connotations of the elemental throughout this symphony. There is much more that could be said about Rautavaara's Third Symphony, both within the two movements we have already looked at, and of course within the last two movements that we unfortunately did not have the chance to enjoy. But unfortunately, we are out of time for today and must stop our preview of this wonderful work here for now.